The Art of Resampling. I think this might sound very technical to you, but just think of vaporwave and chillwave, hip hop, drum and bass, and all so many genres that are basically depend on sampling. Think a little bit what sampling means in the 21st century, in the year 2025, where we have endless capacity on our hard drives and in our DAWs. But still, I think it's an art that deserves to be preserved. Because I think happy accident, this is what defines sampling, and happy accidents can result into very interesting tracks. How efficient is sampling? So very often we talk about a huge of processing. We often talk about creating new and interesting and complex sounds, which takes a lot of processing. But my theory is, or my argument is, that basically you can get to these happy accidents by resampling things. You can just simplify this process because you print things, you print the result of what you actually were doing with the sound to the sound into a new sample. Therefore, you shortcut complexity. But maybe just a step back, what is resampling? Basically, in my opinion, it's about you do something, you print it, you sample it, and then you just use this as your source material and continue from there on. So the best line is just think of a synth line, for example, you add some delay, some reverb, some EQ, and then you sample this one and you go on from there, right? Rather than keeping the source synthesizer hooked up and maybe even continue using the MIDI file. Just record it as it is. And from there, the possibilities are endless. You could pitch up your material or pitch it down. You could just process it in a completely different manner. You could stretch it, you could chop it up, you could layer up things, and you can combine all these technologies together and come up with a completely new soundscape with your own sound, actually, that could define yourself. So you might think, okay, where to start or what should you just sample? Well, basically, of course, you could just sample anything, right? Let's maybe just get started with the vocal sample you have around and where you play around. Or maybe a drum loop, right, that you could just chop up. And then you could maybe record some things from the television and just reuse this as, background texture in your song. Just an idea. Or even maybe just a field recording in your subway, right, in your tube. You just record what people are saying, or basically the reverb of the tube station with the things that are basically put there through the loudspeaker. I think this sounds interesting. This can sound very interesting. So the key is, I think the key is that you actually find something that's worth to play with, that actually interests you. It doesn't have to be final, and I even would love to encourage you to just pick something unusual, like maybe a drum loop, and just go there in the middle and start from there, because then you could come up with completely new rhythm ideas. Just an example, right? If you look for this kind of imperfection, this could be the seed of your creativity. And while you're doing so, just don't forget, give the sound always a little bit of character. And character could be like a phaser, chorus, some delay, some effects on top of that one, because this is what gives the uniqueness to the sample itself. I also consider having some weird bass lines in mind, where you just play around with the starting point and just have new rhythm ideas, for example, right? Or if you chop up any drum loops and come up with these glitchy effects, this is actually what lots of electronic dance music genres define. Or if you think of the ambient break and the time stretching effects that was famous in the 90s in jungle music coming from the Akai samplers, just think of that. You could reverse sounds, so just think of a drum loop and you just reverse it and what that is doing to the kick and the snare. Be with you.
just wanna be with you right now. Just wanna be with you.
Oh my god, guys. While I was cutting the video, I completely realized that I was missing actually talking about how I am implementing this resampling in my studio at all, right? So basically, all I can say, or I want to say is like, I do very often things just directly in Ableton Live or Bitwig, just resample things and then play around, then put it on my drum pad. And this is why I have this here around. So this is really helpful and quite handy, right? But the second thing is, and I always wanted to have this flow, my Digitech actually is connected directly to my mixer. So everything I hear in the studio straight goes to my mixer and the stereo output goes straight into the Digitech. I can just use the stereo output of whatever I hear and directly record into my Digitech. And there are so many happy accidents that happen while I'm doing this process and also playing around with these filters and effects actually that come up with this Electron machine. And the second thing is it's the machine drum, right? I'm not using this so often, to be fair, because it's a little bit more complicated to do the resampling thing in the machine drum, but actually you can do so many more things because the machine drum is capable of resampling in real time. Means like the sequencer runs and then I can record like a small chunk of like a small sample and then play it straight afterwards with another trigger and maybe pitch it up and pitch it down or do whatever. But that doesn't really matter. You can do this kind of resampling techniques however you want with whatever you want to do. And to be fair, I also have this Akai sampler, the S2800, and it's just too complicated. It's nice maybe to play around with and just to realize how things worked in the 90s, but it's just not made for this kind of workflow. So that's why I really think we live in such a grateful, wonderful time having these nice devices around with software, but also the Electron boxes, for example, to resample things. But if you're not really an enthusiast, for example, with the Akai machines or the MPCs or whatever, I would highly encourage you to rather go for some newer devices. Also, you might have seen I, meanwhile, sold again my MPC I used to have. It's just not so intuitive, in my opinion, than other gear. And it was not really helping this kind of creative flow of what I usually have in mind. And finally, in Germany, we say the elephant in the room. It's the granular synthesis. So what is granular synthesis? Granular synthesis, we talk about grains, and grains are basically like the small pieces of a sound file that you actually take as the sample. And then very often in granular synthesis, you can warp between these granulars, these grains. And therefore you can create very interesting soundscapes because you like imagine you have just a chord, for example, recorded, which takes only a few seconds, or usually the source material is just a few seconds long, and then you could stretch it to a longer time, or you could stretch it to your whole song, and therefore you create these very interesting ambient drones that are very unique, right? This is what granular synthesis could be about. So you might have a steep learning curve with getting this technology right to actually think of a melodic and interesting soundscape, but I think the effects are worth to try out. So you see, in a nutshell, you can say with sampling and granular synthesis, it's super easy to come up with a lot of crazy ideas and crazy sounds, but at one point you have to step back and you have to think about how do these sounds fit together actually in a sound, in a song, in a musical context. Here I would call this the refinement stage, because in the refinement stage is just as important as the experimental stage I was just talking a second ago. But in the refinement stage, It's actually your critical producer skills that have to kick in, and you have to decide how do you place these things, and actually you have to justify, or you also judge what you're actually doing with the material that you just created. What is useful, what is not useful. Also think of refinement as removing the distraction of the sound. So very often while producing, especially us as electronic music producers, we add things more and more and more, and it's getting complex and complex, and also you're adding this lush sound. But actually it's about shaping out, craving out these things to actually get the idea come into one's focus, into the listener's focus, and this is now what has to happen in the refinement process. You have to find actually what the samples and the stuff that you created is about. How do you do that? Well, just think of producing music, right? It's about mixing, EQing stuff, compressing stuff, and adding effects basically, right? After you've done the arrangement. And I'm talking about this in that order. So mixing is just about the loudness, right? Is it louder? Is it quieter? Equalizing is you can just remove distracted frequency, that maybe like some rumbling that goes on at the bass part of the sample, or you add some harsh, or you remove some harshness that just come up because of resampling things, or maybe pitching up things, right? And finally you have compression. So if you think of compression, how is this important? Well, just think of maybe you have a drum loop and you resample it, and therefore you have some things going on in the amplitude, right, in the levels of the rhythm itself, and you don't want to have this, especially you might not want to have this, especially if you want to layer up things again, and then you have all these different amplitude levels, so therefore you might want to flatten things with an equalizer. But also the other way around, right, with an equalizer you very often can make things more punchy, kicking out, because you can also have the focus on the attack. And by the way, this is something I learned years after starting to produce music, because no one was actually talking about this, that with a compressor you can actually do the opposite thing, right? So just have this in mind. There are miscellaneous effects you could just consider, like chorus, phaser to actually make or add some movement to your source material, or think of saturation that adds warmth, this analog depth, this analog effect what you want to have. Distortion adds a gritty, punchy, industrial vibe to your sound, just to name a few, right? And then finally, what's next? Well, you have to think, you have to put things into context, right? So context is like, is the sound, the material of what you have in mind, is it more a rhythmic part? Is it a melodic part? Is it a harmonic part? What do you actually do with these things? Or is it replacing maybe a kind of vocalish part, like the singer part, right? So it's all about context and creating context in music. It's one thing to create a sample in isolation and shape this thing, but then very often if you've put things together, it looks completely different or sounds completely different, and you have to have this in mind when doing music. Here comes layering into the game, yeah? If you combine multiple things together and you give it maybe context, you can maybe strengthen things or remove the focus of some stuff. Just having our famous amen break in mind, and you have heard all these different amen breaks already in the different tracks. Just think about so many ways you could process the amen break while doing sampling, and you could also combine these things, multiple amen breaks together, just to create a completely new amen break sample on your own, right? Just an idea. Finally, I believe you can say pretty easy, sampling is just, maybe on the one hand, just another production technique. But it's very handy to actually simplifying things and pushing yourself into one direction, right? So maybe get rid of all this classical music theory of, okay, you have maybe your sound libraries, you have sample libraries, you have classical instruments, right, and focus maybe on notes. But if you actually print things to your sound, you're creating your own sonic library, right? So you define your own individual sonically expression. You're building your own musical blocks with resampling, and this is what music is about, and actually production is about. You're creating your own unique sonical identity, and just get rid of the total control of production and technology, because you're just losing things. You decide, you make your decisions, print this into a sample, and with that one you proceed further and see where this leads you to. Of course, please put into the comments everything I forgot and also what you learned about sampling, and actually keep experimenting, keep creating, and keep your eyes open for the unexpected. So talk to you soon. Bye.